Welcome, everyone, to the AI California College of Fellows Path to Fellowship webinar. My name is Karina Mills. I am your president-elect for AI California. I have the pleasure of introducing our panel today and getting us started with a few housekeeping items. The content portion of this webinar will be 45 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer portion of 30 minutes. For the Q&A, please post your questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom webinar. To do this, click on the Q&A icon, which is represented on the slide. You will click on the Q&A in your Zoom app window. A Q&A window will pop up. Please keep this window open if you wish to post a question. We will be tracking the questions during the webinar and only provide responses during the Q&A. No questions will be responded during the actual presentation, only after in the Q&A session. One additional note, if the question is posted that you are also interested in having answered, please like the question to promote it, and that will help us prioritize questions if we need to do that at the end. All participants will stay muted during the entire presentation. A recording of the session will be made available on our website, and all participants will receive an email notification once it's posted. And then after the session, we'll send out an email that will include resources discussed during the session, along with contact information for each of the regional representatives. It will be sent an email to the email that you used to register for the session. If you are staying till the end, you will receive an hour and a half of learning units for this webinar. And just a reminder that that can take up to 14 days to post. This webinar is designed to provide an overview of the entire AIA fellowship process to assist you in understanding the materials and submission requirements, whether considering submitting this year or next. The College of Fellows is here to assist AIA members considering seeking fellowship. Hopefully this webinar will be a helpful resource to give insights and answer any questions you may have. So you may be wondering what is AIA fellowship? So fellowship is a membership category honoring individuals for their exceptional work and contributions to architecture and society. Fellows use the FAIA designation once they become members of the College of Fellows, and only 3% of AIA members have this designation. Members can apply for fellowship after they have accrued at least 10 years of consecutive architect membership. And architects are reviewed and elevated to the College of Fellows by a jury of their peers, which are fellows. The jury selects candidates who have shown distinction in fulfilling the fellowship objects, which we will review today. The objects will be covered in this presentation and some information about what you need to know from the College of Fellows. And there was going to be a link dropped in the chat. The College of Fellows was founded in 1952 and is comprised of members of the Institute who are elevated to fellowship by a jury of their peers. We have 4 members known as the College of Fellows Executive Committee, which are shown here. And just an anecdote that these very committed to both the AIA at large and the individuals who are in pursuit of this fellowship. So please do note their contacts. The College of Fellows mission is to share interest amongst fellows, promote AIA's goals and values, advance the profession, mentor young architects, and serve society. For California, there are 4 College of Fellows representatives, 2 Northern and 2 Southern, and they're with us today. And I'm going to pause here to allow them to introduce themselves to you.
Hi, my name is Mike Enomoto. I'm the managing partner of Gruen Associates. I've been an architect since 1975, and I received my fellowship in 2007.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Robert Woolley. I'm a regional rep for Southern California with Michael. I spent almost my entire career in the public sector, for which I received fellowship. My practice was limited to Santa Barbara County, so it was very challenging for me to be elevated. It took all 3 years of the process in order for that to happen. And you'll hear Aaron and I talk about something over and over and over again, and that is the ripple effect or the golden thread. He and I will talk about that. And connecting the dots from your sponsor letter all the way through to the back. I was elevated in 2015 and joined the College of Fellows Heritage Society in 2018 as a 3-diamond fellow, and I'm delighted to be with my colleagues today.
Thank you. My name is Joyce Paul Hamus, and I'm a Northern California representative. I'm also a vice president at Smith Group Architects. I've led the San Francisco office for the past decade, and I now lead the senior housing market sector. I'm licensed in 6 states, and I became a fellow in 2015 as well, under Object 2 relative to senior living and the ripple effect on that. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Aaron Highland. Good afternoon. And I'm a preservation architect, been practicing here in San Francisco about 35 years. In addition to focusing on my preservation and design, I've also focused on practice management and helped build the firm that I was with for many decades. I'm currently consulting in both capacities. I was elevated in 2019, the last in-person one before the pandemic. So I felt very lucky. And my object was Object 2, and that is practice management, but also with a thread of my preservation, more specifically the intangible cultural heritage. So it was a story beyond just the physical impact of the buildings that we restored.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today, for all of your contributions to our profession and all that you put forth towards AIA Fellows. I now have the opportunity to turn it over to Mr. Robert Uhle, FAIA, who will review the required steps for fellowship.
Thank you, Karina, and hi again, everybody. Aaron and I are going to bounce back and forth a little bit as we walk you through the details of the essential requirements in your submission to fellowship. And we'll start with some broad strokes and then move on to more specifics. The entire process is challenging. It will require a good deal of your time. It will potentially be emotionally draining for you, depending on how challenging that effort is. You will challenge your career assumptions. And after you put your heart and soul into these 40 pages, it could wind up being a devastating outcome. So if you're prepared for all of that, these are the steps that you're going to complete as you go along. Just in broad strokes, you have to determine if you're eligible. You've got to assemble a crackerjack team. One of the most challenging things you're going to have to do is pick the right object and then map out the strategy for your submission. And remember always that your audience is the jury. You're speaking to the jury. You're not speaking to anybody else. So it is a very unique document to prepare for an audience of 7. So how do you figure out if you're eligible? I would say the most important thing on this slide is a member in good standing. Having 10 cumulative years, not consecutive. You don't need to be a member from year 1 to year 10. It's cumulative. So if you lapsed in your membership for any amount of time, don't worry about it. You just have to make sure you have 10 cumulative years. But I think the most important thing is a member in good standing. And I'll share a story of a nominee here in Santa Barbara who put together a fantastic nomination package. She had great references, great story to tell, magical golden thread. but the jury never saw her submission because one of her reference writers was not a member in good standing. So what does that mean? It means that your dues are current, there are no disciplinary actions in the works, your annual CE units are current, and your license is current. So make sure when you're putting that team together that you do some due diligence and ask each member of your team to check their status to find out where they are. And you can do that by sending an email to AIA membership history at aia.org. I think Rebecca will probably post that in the chat as well, just to back it up. All right, so make sure you're in good standing. That includes yourself. And know that at the time of submission, your good standing is determined in December, not at the time you push the send button. AIA staff will vet everything from the time you submit it until January when the jury gets your nomination. And so you have all the way to December to make sure that all of those points are well taken. All right, who does your team involve? You've got to have a nominator, you've got a sponsor, and reference writers. Generally, the nominator is the chapter that you are assigned to. Even if it's a small chapter, it's the chapter president or secretary who signs that nomination document. If that is not your case, you can assemble 5 fellows to submit the nomination for you. And for the first time in 2025, all of that is online. It used to be a piece of paper you had to get your chapter or nominees to sign, but now it's all electronic. On to your sponsor. This is, I would say, of all of the challenges of this process, picking the sponsor, writing your 35 words, and choosing an object are probably the most difficult things that you will do in this whole effort. Your sponsor needs to know you, needs to know your practice, needs to know your work, and is somebody who you can receive criticism from, because you've got to check your emotions and your ego when you're putting this together and just receive honest input that the object you're going for is going to work for you. So your sponsor does that. The other thing your sponsor does is supposed to kind of wrangle the references in the background. You are supposed to have very little to do with your references, and that's next. So pick these references very carefully. The jury is not interested in your references if they're all coming from your area, or if a majority of them are from the firm that you work in. You need to demonstrate that there is a broad voice that supports you, and the more geographically it is, the better. So, a friend in New York who knows your work, get that person to write a letter. Nebraska, Washington, wherever. Make sure it's diverse. Also, make sure that they are current and members in good standing, because if they're not, the jury is looking for a reason to keep you in the nomination process, not necessarily kick you out. So it's challenging. So your first year, you get 7 letters. 5 of them must be from architects. Your second year, you can add 3 more letters to that. And the third year, you can add 3 more for a total of 13. We'll talk about the details of some of the letter writing in a few minutes. Now, choosing your object, like I said, is probably one of the most difficult things to do. It is very important that you try and keep your emotions out of picking the object. Architects we know have very healthy egos, and the challenge is that you can't think. Well, you might think that you're the best thing since Frank Gehry, but you need to be really honest about that selection of objects and be as objective as possible. And Aaron's going to take us through those objects now.
Thanks, Robert. Yes. So there are 6 objects. Just a few years ago, they added a 6th one. There was 5 previously. And the most important thing is that your object be very narrow. This is not about telling your whole life story about all the great buildings that you worked on and why all your clients like working with you. That is not what this is about. And so you need to, as Robert said, get really kind of be a little more humble, although this document is anything but humble. But instead of thinking about all the great work that you've done, think about the impact that your work and your involvement in other things outside your work has done. And then as you understand that, the objects will make more sense. So there are 6 objects. These are what they're actually called, but I'm going to give you their nicknames because their nicknames have led to a little bit of misunderstandings, and we'll get into each one of them. But object 1 has always been called design. Object 2 is practice. Object 3 is leading the institute. And as I said, each one of these, there's some nuances to it. And as we get into each one of the specifics, you'll understand. Number 4 is public service. Number 5 is service to society. And then the 6th one that they added, they brought education out. And previously it was confusing because it could have been combined in any one of 3, 4, or 5. Next slide. So object 1 is design. And what's important here is it's not just design, meaning what are the buildings that you've designed. It's also urban design and it's preservation. So, what are the buildings that you've restored and how significant are they? So there are a considerable number of fellows who have gotten design who are actually preservation architects. And we'll get into some of the myths and facts later. But in object 1, you need to be the lead design on the project. The jury's looking for your peers and how they've recognized you. So you need to have awards. And so you want to show your first 5 most important projects that have the most recognition. And your portfolio, which will be in the exhibits, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, needs to show and represent that. And we'll get into the details of that. Next slide, object 2. So object 2 is practice management, but it's also technical advancement. And this is one of the areas. So if you are a behind the scenes architect that has done a lot of research, and that research has really kind of rippled across the community, that is recognition for elevation to fellow. Practice management is how have you built your practice? How have you built the firm that you have led? And then also it is looking for how you have taken what you've done in building your firm out to the profession and sharing that with the profession. Involvement in the AIA presentations. Project awards are less important. But as we get into the exhibits, you will need to show, I think there's 5 projects required in practice as well. The next slide. So leading the institute, object 3. This is a little bit of a misnomer because it doesn't mean that you have to spend half your career waving the AIA flag and going to AIA National and becoming the AIA president. You can do it across the entire profession. So there's related organizations. So right now, one that's really kind of picking up is Design Build Institute of America, DBIA. There's a lot of architects in AIA and DBIA. There's CSI, Construction Specification Institute. They've been involved with, there's been a lot of overlap between the two for many years. So you can, and then SCUP for university work. So there's other ways to really be involved in leading not only the AIA Institute, but our profession. And what's probably most important is the so what. They're not looking for people who have just been on boards and have joined committees and have gone to all the conferences. They want to see that you've shared your story, that you've, you know, impacted other organizations, and that you're, you know, you're more than just a volunteer, right? That's what Object 3 is looking for. So if you think that because you've been so involved in these organizations and you have that resume, that may not get you in the elevated to fellow. Object 4 is public service. So this is, I think, Robert, you were in Object 4. I got
Yes.
that correct. So campus architects, government architects, it's really a good, there's, you know, a lot of our clients are in this category. And I think that folks who submit in this category get some of their architects that they hired to sign their exhibits and to write letters for them and that sort of thing. So this has always been a really strong, a strong object. We have a lot of folks in this one. The 5th one is service to society. And there's a slight misnomer here too, because it could be an alternative career. So you may have gone into tech, you know, that's a current thing. So people have helped build, you know, tech campuses internally, or some really interesting theoretical approach to how, you know, technology and information impacts our lives. But this is probably one of the most difficult ones of the objects to get elevated in. Service to society, what they're going to be looking for if you're going into this is press, awards, recognition, newspaper articles. And it's kind of unfortunate because people who focus in this category are more humble and they're not really that well, you know, recognized for their efforts. So getting the collateral around this object is a challenge. And then lastly is education. And this was buried in a few of the other ones, and it caused a lot of confusion for folks. And I think a lot of people didn't get elevated because they chose the wrong object to try to share their stories. So a few years ago, I think it was like 4 years ago, they pulled this out. One interesting part about this is that you can actually use your students' work. So if you're a teacher and your students have made a huge impact and you have helped, you know, them do the research, or they were part of your research team, you can use that as part of your exhibits. What's the next one? And I think that's back to you, Robert.
Yes, thanks, Aaron. So, you know, what's the anatomy of this package that you're going to put together? First of all, you are limited to 40 pages. I would say 40 official pages. You can have a few additional pages that don't count, like put a cover on your nomination. Use a section break between section 1 and 2 and 3, where you might have an additional opportunity to share a photograph that's underneath section 2 heading. A table of contents on your exhibits, as an example, doesn't count. And it helps to orient the jury to your story. And of course, all along the way, you are building this golden thread from the very beginning all the way through these documents. So in section 1, you've got a sponsor letter. It's a single page and a summary of achievements. Section 2, your significant work. It's broken up into 3 subgroups: your significant work, your awards and honors, and publications. And section number 3, exhibits. Back in the day, there was actually a section 4 where you put a table of your reference letter writers, but now that's all done online and is supposed to be blind to you. And we'll talk a little more in detail about that. There are other materials that are included in your submission, and you gather these and post these as part of the electronic process. We'll start at the bottom. You got to have a headshot. They want to see what you look like. If you have used any images in your exhibits or anywhere in your submission that you do not own the copyright for, you have to make sure that you submit image credits and have the permission to use that material. And AIA will check, and that could be a means of disqualification if you don't have that done. There's a code of ethics and other materials. They're primarily checkboxes on the electronic submission. And your nomination form, again, is done electronically. And it's back to you, Aaron.
And so the sponsor letter and section 1 are both 1 page, and they're the first and second page. These are probably the 2 most important pieces of your entire nomination. And if you actually nail these 2 pieces, some of your jurors may not even look much at section 2 and 3. And the key is being very narrow and very clear. And you have your thread and 3 supporting topics around that thread. Don't tell your whole life story. And your sponsor letter, the person who's your sponsor will write, you can write this letter together, unlike your reference letters, but the sponsor letter sets it up. The summary page will tee it off, or knock the ball, I guess you can say. The sponsor letter tees it off, and the section 1 will hit the ball. The section 1 you want to do first. The sponsor letter you want to do last. So that's kind of think about it, and really focus on what the ripple effect. 3 main points and your ripple effect. One of the myths is that you have to have work all over the country and be this internationally recognized or nationally recognized practitioner. And that's just not true. That's not true at all. And, you know, as Robert has said, you know, being a campus architect, your work is really focused. And maybe you're an architect that works on a campus, you know, as a consultant, right? I had I know one architect who did a lot of work at Stanford, and his thread was talking about how the work at Stanford in that typology was picked up by other universities. And so that's the broad impact that you're looking for. On the, I think what the next page is, next slide. No, we'll go back one. The last thing I wanted to point out on the summary on page section 1 is your summary statement. You're going to have a 35-word summary statement at the top of section 1.0. There's a ton of example nominations on the AI website. Look at them and read all of the summary statements and see if there's any inspiration there. But this is, if you can, as I said already, if your juror that's reviewing your nomination, if it nails it in the section 1, you're 90% there. Okay, Robert, you're gonna do section 2.
Yeah, thank you. It's the most difficult 35 words you'll ever write in your life. There's a lot of information on this slide, so there's a lot to unpack, but basically section 2, if you're tracking the framework, you've got about 25 or 28 pages, depending on how many pages you devote to your exhibit section to get this story across. And there are 3 sections. And it's helpful to use an outline method in a way so that you are leading the jury through the material. If they have to work, I'll tell you an anecdotal story. I had a friend over for dinner, and he said, I don't like seafood. And I said, well, okay, well, a lot of people are allergic to seafood and shell food. So I thought, okay, so we won't serve him seafood. And then I asked him, he said, so why don't you like? And he said, I just don't want to work for my food. So for the jury, you don't want them to work to try and figure out your story. You want to make that bright line really bright. So you've got 25 to 28 pages to do this. Significant work. This is your resume. Put it in reverse chronology. The newest stuff first and the oldest stuff last. Recognition. This is media coverage. in whatever format that is, magazine, print, television, and then publications. To some degree, this will mean more if you're in object one, and mean less if you're in other objects. So take a look at that and make sure you're driving home the point of that ripple effect and broad impact. Back to you, Aaron.
So section 3 are your exhibits, and I want to clarify something. And I think, Robert, over every year, the requirements can change. So make sure you look at the application and the online and what those requirements are. I believe currently for this year, maybe last couple of years, your exhibits are 20 pages and section 1 and 2 are 20 pages. And I think they're very specific, and I don't think dividers count. But the point here is make sure you make sure you follow the rules or the you know, what's laid out in the application. It's very clear, and they will disqualify you if you don't follow them. These exhibits, like I said, are 20 pages. If you're in section 1 or object 2, you're going to need 5 projects. If you're an object, let's say 5 for service to society, you may have no project work in there. Pictures tell the story. If you're in design, sharing process, design development process, yes, show the pretty pictures. Everyone, you know, is really impressed with the really pretty pictures. But if there's a story to be told and you have diagrams that can support it, use that. And then if you have volunteer work, any kind of press, any kind of, you know, ripple, just, you know, so for mine, some of the things that we did here in San Francisco were picked up in San Antonio and Seattle, and there was all kinds of press that came around that. And so in one of my exhibits, I kind of showed that, and that showed the ripple effect across the geographic reach. What else? I think that's about it, probably. But yeah, 5 projects. And the one thing that they say is that if you're in object 1, you put your projects first. And if you're in the other objects, you put your objects last. I don't know if that's necessary. I think you need to tell the story through the exhibits and build along your thread. Oh, one last thing. The person, you have to actually have every object certified. You need to have someone sign what you state in each object or each exhibit, and they do not want that to be someone within your firm. So you want to use your clients, other, you know, important people that were involved with the project, planning director, whatnot, and think about those 5 or 6 or 7 signatures as additional references. That can be important and helpful.
Thank you, Aaron. I would add to your points that if it's an architect signing that exhibit, he'd better have membership in good standing. All right, your reference letters. This entire section is supposed to be blind to you. If AIA and the jury check to find out that you were involved in the specifics of any of these letters, then that is a means of disqualification. However, you can provide them framework. Most letter writers, when you ask them to write a letter, well, can you give me a framework? Can you sketch it out for me? So you want to make sure that at least you provide them a framework. Generally, the first paragraph is going to indicate how they know you and how long they've known you. The second and third paragraph is going to highlight the golden thread and possibly point out an exhibit of your work as an example of how you know their work. And then the last paragraph, depending on how much you want to write about it, will be your impact on the profession. And then finally, the last one is reinforcing their support for you. And these are all submitted electronically. You basically provide through your online application the names and email addresses of your references, and then the College of Fellows reaches out and gets them the letters submitted electronically, and your hands are off. Your sponsor can be involved, but your hands are off. Aaron's back to Joyce. Back to you.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to talk about the year eligibility. It is a 3-year potential process. You submit a first year, a second year, or a third year application, and the big impact is, depending on which year, it impacts your number of reference letters that you include. Again, starting with 7 and then adding 3 for the second year and another 3 for the third year, so total possible of 13 letters. If you take a cycle off, you revert back to the first year status. And I think that's one of the questions in the Q&A. So if you took a year off, you go back. Otherwise, the second and third year submissions only apply when you're consecutive cycles, if you're applying consecutively. And after the third year, if you're not elevated, then you are not eligible for the next cycle, but you start all over again with cycle 1 the following year, and as resubmit as a first year candidate. I should note that the jury expects to see a response to the previous comments in the second and third year portfolios that you submit if you're submitting for the second or third year. So allow time for that. It takes a lot of editing to make sure you respond to the comments. And the only antidote I would say is if you don't get selected the first year or the second year or in the third year, don't get discouraged. I know it's a ton of work, but the process helps you hone and find your thread. So it's kind of a personal and a professional journey. It's really it's not just about all the work you do, but it really, if you need to keep replying, it's because you have to hone that thread. And so the more you focus on that, the more you own it and the more you get to celebrate it. So don't get discouraged. So in summary, being clear and precise and concise in your presentation. It could be good for some people to hire an editor just to help make sure that you're concise. It needs to be in your words and it's your story. So it's not a marketing person or a PR firm, but it's someone that can help you stay concise and to the point. The strong sponsor, specific references, and again, the summary statement, those 35 words are the most challenging part. Narrowing your golden thread to one object. And it's not your entire career, just one path. And often when I'm talking to people submitting, they keep talking about all these other things that they did that are tangents to it. And it's like they're great, they were great things, but they're not sticking with your thread. So it's really takes a lot of diligence. Focus on your achievements and the results, the impact, and the influence on the profession. That on.
So now you have your nomination together, all 40 pages. And it's interesting because someone told me once, actually my sponsor, said at this point, if you're not completely embarrassed and wouldn't want anyone to read this because it tells everyone that you've changed the world, you haven't done enough in your nomination. And it's kind of counter because none of us are sole and fountainheads, right? We work in teams, and it's hard for us to take credit when we know it was a bigger effort than just us. But these are your 40 pages telling how you've changed the world. And you're going to hand that off to one person in the jury. So the next slide. So the jury is comprised of 7 members. And I'm sorry, go back to the last slide, my mistake. The jury has 7 members, and they get about 300 to 400, maybe, 100 and, I don't know, they get about 30 to 40 applications per juror, depending on how many were submitted that year. And so your juror is going to spend probably no more than 1 hour reading your nomination. You've spent a year putting it together. You're crying over it. It may be your second and third year, and they're going to spend 1 hour. So think about that and make sure that you drive your point home being narrow and focused. After they spend the 1 hour, they're your surrogate. They get, and we can go to the next slide. They get probably, I think this slide says 10 to 12 minutes. I think that's generous. I think they get about 6 or 7 minutes. So you've spent an entire year putting this packet together. The juror that's been assigned to your packet, your nomination, reviews it for an hour, and they spend at most 5 minutes making the case to the other 6 jurors. And they'll use your summary page and your exhibits as collateral. So make it clear, easy. So if you get them into section 1, make sure your exhibits give them some really good collateral to convey your entire career to the juror in 5 minutes. And then after they do that, they deliberate. Next slide. And only 6 of the jurors vote. And you don't have to get 6 votes. You only have to get 4. And if you're split 3 and 3, they put your nomination to the end and they come back to it. So that's it. At the end of this long, arduous process, it all comes down to about 10 minutes, maybe.
Extraordinary, isn't it? You spend 900 hours putting something together, and they only see it for 5 minutes. So just to reinforce these points, that sponsor letter needs to be crisp. The jury is going to look for consistency. They're going to look for the beginning of that thread in the sponsor letter, and then they're going to look through it all the way through to the end. And it's that surrogate member of the jury who's making your case. The jury member who reviews you is not going to be from the West Coast. They're going to be from the East Coast or the North or the South. They tend to distribute the nominations across the other sectors so that there's no bias. Again, make sure you've got that golden thread. It needs to be really bright. So they're looking for published work. They're looking for awards. The more broad the award recognition, the better. Not just from your local chapter, but from state organizations or national organizations, or even other organizations. It doesn't need to be AIA necessarily. They're looking for your impact. Depending on what object you're in. So remember, object 1 is design, 2 is innovation and firm, 3 is led the institute, object 4 is public sector, object 5 is alternative service, AKA citizen architect kind of things, and last is education. So depending on which one you're in will depend on how much effort you have to put toward each one of these parts. So again, publications, awards, not necessarily requests to speak, but that you spoke. And then serving on juries, not necessarily that. It's kind of like the Oscars, right? You were nominated 14 times, but never actually won the award, right? So you actually want to be serving on juries is going to be a stronger thing. Leading seminars, writing publications, articles, etc. All of these will contribute and support your underlying experience. So as an example, these points are best fit object 3, led the institute. And it isn't necessarily important that you held a national office. It's that you were involved at a national level, either on a committee or a jury, or supporting the organization in that way. That you wrote articles, that you led conference sessions, etc. All of those are important. And Aaron, it's back to you.
So the myths and facts. So this is interesting because there's a whole lot of folklore. I think the biggest one is that everyone thinks that the 5-letter reference letters have to be fellows. Quite frankly, you need the best reference letters to can support your thread. And if they're fellows, it's even better, but they don't have to be. The reference letters should only be AIA members. No, you need 5, and it's actually better if you have 2 client letters who are not in the profession, or a planning director, or someone from a urban design, or someone outside of our profession. So you don't have to have 7 AIA members. You definitely, for first year submissions, you do have to have 5, but the other 2, it's probably better to have someone outside the profession. Joyce touched on this, but the second and third years, you get 3 additional ones. Those do not have to be AIA. You still only need to have 5 that have AIA memberships. And they do allow you to change letters, or at least currently they did. At some point they didn't, but in your second and third submission, you can go back and revise some of your previous letters. Strategy. So again, make sure your nomination is clear and concise. Make sure it's coordinated. Have your reference letters only focus on a couple points. You don't want to have every single reference letter talking about your entire submission. Have 2 or 3 third-party reviewers. There are a couple resources available, which I think Joyce will get to in a second. But having someone actually help you review your nomination and read it for clarity and understanding is really important. Maybe 2 or 3 people. And do this early. It takes, I would say, at least 9 months to really do this right. You can compress it into 6 months, but that's about the minimum. So if you haven't started this year for this next cycle, I would say you're not ready to submit in October. And then the last slide, and then the facts. The fellows in your chapter, we are supportive. We're supportive. We want to get as much broad representation in the College of Fellows as we can. Same with AIA California Council. Well, AIA California. And not all nominees are elevated. It's just the fact. So it does, I don't know what, there's no quota. So it's either you're elevated or you're not based on the vote. And so a considerable amount of people, and it takes 2 or 3 times. So that's about it, I think. Next slide. Yeah, it's Joyce.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm going to go through some of the resources that Aaron mentioned. And the first one is, again, the local chapters and components. So of the 21 California chapters, 5 have established fellowship committees: Los Angeles, Orange County, Pasadena, Foothill, San Francisco, and Santa Barbara. So although not all of the components have a committee, these 5 local components have information and reps that can help all of the surrounding areas. So they're a good resource. LA and San Francisco have their own peer review and nominating processes as well. And that the other chapters are there to help. We're going to be putting in the link and in the chat links to other components and what they have, to all 5 of those, so that you can reach out to yours or reach out to one of those if you're not in one of those areas, as well as the regional reps. Robert, Aaron, Michael, and myself. Aaron and I are the Northern California reps, and Michael and Robert, again, are the Southern California reps. They're here to help you as well. So you have a lot of help and support, so please use it. And the next one, resources. This is going to be super helpful. These links are all going to be posted in the chat and sent to you in an email after. Some of them have been mentioned. The sample fellowship application is an important one. Obviously, the nomination signature and photographer license is important. the ones I wanted to call out most distinctly is well, I like to check the disqualification checklist just as a reminder of what to do and not to do. But the real helpful one before you get started is the example of successful applications. It's a great reference of summary statements, and they're curated to be the best examples or the ones that will show up initially on the page. You can always look back and find other ones back to, I think, 2014 or 2009, but they put kind of the highlights of them. And it's good to not only look at the object you're considering, but what the summary statements were for other objects, just to make sure you're in the right zone of where you should be. So you can look them up by object number and by subcategory. So super helpful. Spend your time perusing that because that will be a good guide for you. Yeah, so the submission timelines. We're focusing now kind of on the 2026 because we're assuming that you're either in it for right now to submit in October, and if you haven't started, it's going to be a tough race to get there. But these timelines on the next slide are for all cycles, for all years. It opens in June. You need to check the web page to make sure you have the exact date. The submissions are due in October, so it's a few short months. Then that January, the jury convenes, and then in mid-February, you're notified, probably the second week in February, and then the public announcement comes out at the end. So please check the websites for the dates and the fees because they may change over the years. Erin mentioned a timeline of 9 months. I would also think of thinking about it in terms of 18 months because it takes time to keep a record of everything. I found that just looking back for drawings and for going through anything that I spoke at or whatever, it's just that's a long process. So unless you can keep it now like a journal of all your speaking engagements, all your conferences, all your accomplishments, awards, contacts for your reference letters. I mean, all those things, you should start curating that at least 18 months, I think. So the point is, don't wait till June when the submissions open. You should have been doing it. So now's a good time to start for 2026, I guess is the summary of this. That's what we're focusing on. Now would be a good time to get ready for that. And next one is now we're heading into the Q&A section. So I am going to pick the ones that have come up. If you haven't added your question, please put it in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and ideally upvote on some of the ones to push them to the top. So one of those, and I guess since Michael hasn't, I guess we'll let Michael answer this or pass it to somebody if you don't know. The question is, if you're a long-standing and in good standing AIA member for many consecutive years, but any given years had below the required learning units, but your dues were always paid, does that have a negative impact? So I guess if you were behind on your CEUs in a particular years.
I believe at the time of submission, you have to have all your learning units in place.
And if you didn't,
I would echo that. You know, they're not looking at all of your cumulative years and whether or not you were in good standing or not in any of those years. It's the year that you submit.
Good standing by the December of that year.
Yes.
So you can catch
Yes.
up on CEUs. Yeah. Can any videos or media clips be submitted?
I don't think they have a way to play them consistently. And of course, you know, if you did submit one and they couldn't play it, that won't go well for you.
Yeah, I don't believe outside links are allowed. So if you want to like put a link to a website into one of your exhibits, they're not going to click through to it.
So risky.
Risky.
If you have emeritus status in good standing and are current on their CEUs, is this status permitted to apply? I guess is emeritus acceptable?
I would say yes, because emeritus is a category of membership. And of course, when you're emeritus, CE units don't count and dues don't count. So because you're emeritus.
That's a great question. We haven't had that one before.
And do any of you know the average number of submissions in any given year?
That's a very good question. I was gonna email Myrna and ask her that earlier today.
I think they're
My
between
guess-
150 and 300.
Yeah, my guess would be just looking at the stats over the years, it's roughly about 300, 290 to 315-ish, somewhere in that neighborhood, and maybe 50. I think at the most 100 were elevated one year, but generally it's like 50 or 60 or somewhere in that number. Does that ring true for any of the other fellows?
My year actually had 140 elevated, which was a very high year.
very
yeah.
high. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Robert. It's right around 250 are submitted each year, and about 40 to 50% get elevated of that in one way or another.
Okay. Many of this person's reference letters are from retired FAIAs. Is that a problem? And what do they do for letterhead?
Want to take that, Michael?
I don't know the answer to that.
So they can be letter reference writers. If they're retired and don't have a company logo, they can put it on their own personal letter. They can just put their title and address on the letter. The one thing I was going to say is that make sure that if you're resubmitting, that if you have a previous letter writer, you do have to go back and make sure that they're still alive.
Yeah.
We've had people who've been disqualified because they had submitted a letter writer, and in a follow-up, and they were told that in their comments, and in the follow-up, they didn't update that letter, and it actually led to a disqualification.
It's because really the mix of letters can change from year to year. Online, you indicate which reference writer you want to include in section 4. So you can ask them to resubmit a new letter. You can put in a new reference from year 1 to 2 to 3. But it's in terms of letterhead, I don't think the jury is looking for somebody with letterhead. It just has to be a valid person. If it's an architect, needs to be in good standing. An AIA member, good standing.
I do think the current instructions say if they're with a firm, they want it on the firm letterhead.
That's correct.
Or if like an institution like Santa Barbara.
If you're writing in the voice of that entity, then it needs to be on their letterhead.
A question from the Fellows Committee Staff Liaison. How does the new process for nomination signatures work? I think that's on the form.
It's electronic. So I believe I didn't go through the application process online, but it's electronic. So you're going to give the name of the email to the secretary of the chapter or the president, and they're going to email that and then get it acknowledged.
Yeah, if you're talking about the nomination from the chapter, yes, that's how it's an electronic process. If the question is also about the signatures within your actual nomination, you actually have to have a physical PDF signature on the PDF that you submit for your exhibits.
Yeah.
But I think afterwards they ask you to submit one. Once you get elevated, they ask you to submit it without signatures so that they don't publish the signatures.
You got to redact the personal information.
Yeah.
Question. Is there a good way to find an experienced consultant to guide the process and review the package? The few that this person had been referred to in the Bay Area have retired. Any new recommendations?
It's challenging.
It is challenging, and there's a large conversation within the college about whether one needs to actually or ought to need to hire a writer and a graphic designer. But I would say, if you're not a good graphic designer, make sure you hire a good graphic designer or have someone within your firm who does that work. It does make a slight difference. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to look good. It doesn't have to be, you know, fantastic graphic design. It just has to look good. And you should have someone edit it. So if you have a marketing person that writes well within your organization, that's great. You can work with someone to just read what you've written.
Yeah, I would reach out to the various chapters that have fellow committees and try to reach into their networks, because someone will know someone who will know someone.
Yeah, there's about 10 or 12 that across the country that do it. I know, but I know several have retired, definitely here on the West Coast.
Okay, sorry. As a second year submitter, am I required to have my original 7 letters rewritten and addressed to the new chair?
No,
No.
they're already on file.
If you, these keep bouncing up around, are the jurors aware of how many years you've submitted?
Yes. And they're looking
And
for
they look,
and they're looking for you to respond to the comments of the jury
Exactly.
with them.
that is a disqualification. If you submit